Assalamu alaikum everyone. Hello, good afternoon, and thank you very much for being here. So I'll be talking about a small section of something that I covered in my PhD thesis when I first started a number of years ago, and it's called the BRIT Questionnaire, and it's part of the BRIT project, and that stands for Building Resilience Through Integration and Trust. So to give you an overview then, it's part of the UK's counter-terrorism strategy. So I'll say a little bit about the main counter-terrorism strategies and policies that are of importance and relevance to what I'd like to focus on here, and then introduce the BRIT questionnaire together with ERG 22+, plus the VAF, or the Vulnerability Assessment Framework, and highlighting how the three of these are linked. And then what I'd like to do is to analyse the BRIT questionnaire from three perspectives. The methodological analysis being a quick overview of the cognitive development theories and the extent to which these could be applied to the BRIT questionnaire. And the reason for this being that the questionnaire is aimed at children, as the title of the talk suggests. Corpus linguistic analysis, which I'll explain in more detail in a while, and the results of a pilot study that I conducted with the questionnaire to show the extent to which one can say it's effective or not. And then looking a little bit more at securitization, bringing it up to date with current events that are unfolding. So the UK's counter-terrorism strategy is called Contest. It's in 4 parts. It was developed in 2003, like most counter-terrorism strategies around the world, developed shortly after 9/11. And we're currently on our 6th iteration here in the UK. That was published in July of last year. And it's in 4 parts, which are Pursue, which is about foiling terrorist plots and looking at the threats and investigating those threats and looking at how to mitigate them. Protect is about focusing on vulnerabilities and how to reduce vulnerabilities in different parts around different parts of the UK. For example, at borders, transport networks, the infrastructure, how that can be protected, and then also things like crowded events. So if it's the Olympics or a concert and things like this. Prepare is about resilience. This is like in the eventuality of a terrorist attack, how does the UK cope with that? How does they cope with the aftermath, mitigating the impacts, and being resilient, demonstrating resilience? And there's Prevent, which a number of you may already have heard about, be familiar with, Prevent strategy. This is the largest part of the Contest strand, and its focus is anti-radicalisation. And what I'm going to be focusing on today is closely aligned with the Prevent strategy. What's most interesting about this is that it's implemented through devolved responsibility. And so that is that unlike most other countries, the UK has a system where there's a legal mandate and a legal obligation upon people in specified authorities across a number of sectors where we have to, anywhere where we are public facing, there has to be an assessment, a scrutiny of people that we're engaging with to determine whether they're demonstrating any signs of susceptibility to radicalisation or extremism along those lines. And if that's the case, then they're referred to counter-terrorism officers in the UK. So the education sector is one of these. So essentially, it's part of the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act, which came out in 2015, and specifically Section 26, Part 1, which says that staff in specified authorities, for instance, schools, colleges, universities, hospitals, medical clinics, prisons, youth services, psychology services, leisure centres, the list goes on and on. There are about 36 different categories here, have a legal obligation to, quote, have due regard to the need to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. And in schools specifically, Prevent Duty Guidance 2015 states that it's essential that staff are able to identify children who may be vulnerable to radicalisation. What happens is that the suspected cases are referred to Prevent for assessment, and then where it's deemed necessary, some of the cases are then referred to the Channel programme, which is a multi-agency deradicalisation program. But what's noteworthy here is that it's a voluntary program. So say someone is identified as being susceptible to radicalisation, an assessment is done, and the officers think, yes, this person is at risk. What then happens subsequently, depending on how severe that risk is deemed to be, if it's not deemed to be severe enough for them to be prosecuted, but they can be released back into the community, it's up to the individual as to whether or not they accept to go on to the Channel program, the deradicalisation program. So what the Channel process says is that it's about providing support to individuals who are at risk of being drawn into violent extremism. And it looks at existing collaborations between local authorities, the police, statutory partners, etc. And so what is it that, how is extremism defined? Well, the government defined extremism as vocal or active opposition to fundamental British values, including democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, mutual respect, and tolerance of different faiths and beliefs. But there is an emphasis on British values and opposition to that. So fundamental British values, according to the Department for Education and Lord Nash, both independent and state-maintained schools have a duty to actively promote fundamental British values, democracy, rule of law, and so forth. But this, of course, as you may imagine, has been quite controversial, because a lot of people have said, well, to what extent are these values fundamentally British? Are they not universal? Are they not, values that people around the world have? So, for example, at a National Union of Teachers conference that was held shortly after this statement was released, Alex Kenny, who's an executive member of the National Education Union, said, quote, "How many more times do we have to spell out that there is nothing uniquely British about these values? They are human values held by people all over the world. They are the values of my Iraqi dentist and my Pakistani doctor." Nevertheless, schools are still obligated to promote fundamental British values. And the channels for this are the national curriculum, extracurricular activities, and then this is inspected via Ofsted, who go into the schools to determine the extent to which schools are meeting the requirements laid out by the government in terms of standards of education. Now, linked to this is something called ERG 22+, or Extremism Risk Guidance 22+. The creators of this model, of this notion, were Dr. Christopher Dean and Dr. Monica Lloyd, both of whom were forensic psychologists with links to the national security industry. And what they did was, back in 2000 and between 2008 and 2011, they focused on terrorists, convicted terrorists, adults incarcerated in prisons who'd been convicted of terrorism and convicted of extremism. And they wanted to meet with these people, interview them, to determine what kind of factors were common that could be identified and say, well, when these factors emerge, these are common risk factors which point to someone being more susceptible to extremism. So they developed this ERG 22+ model, and they released the study to the government in 2010. The government then used ERG 22+ to develop something called the Vulnerability Assessment Framework, which is widely used across various specified authorities, including the education sector, particularly in schools. So the Vulnerability Assessment Framework has three key dimensions. These are engagement, intent, and capability. And the dimension of intent to cause harm is what is important, because this is the one that's linked to the notion, this BRIT questionnaire and so on. So intent to cause harm, as defined by the government, is when an individual or a group of people over-identify with an ideology or another group. Us and them thinking. Dehumanizing the enemy. Attitudes that justify offending. Or harmful means to an end, harmful objectives. So what's important here is that this vast dimension of intent is what underpins the questions that were developed for the original BRIT questionnaire, which was administered to school children, which is a part of the Building Resilience Through Integration and Trust project. So what we saw when this was released initially in 2015 was that particularly it started in London, across schools in London, and what the government decided was to start with the London Borough of Waltham Forest. And you can see a web page here from the Hub, the education network for them, and it's listing here useful resources for the BRIT project, things like being and belonging package, who am I belong in the community, in my country, I belong online, I want to make a difference. So all these things linked to identity and community. And that's because the BRIT project was touted as being about community integration and cohesion and identity. But what's the specifics of the BRIT questionnaire that was launched in tandem with this? So it was launched in 2015 with 7 tick box questions, and it was administered to 8 to 11-year-olds across 5 primary schools in the first instance in what was classed as 22% Muslim London Borough of London of Waltham Forest. And this is because it was said that when we look at the other boroughs in London, most of them have an average population of approximately 5% Muslims. But Waltham Forest is a little bit different in the sense that it's 22%, so let's launch it here with Muslim, where there are a higher proportion of Muslims. So 2 questions, numbers 2 and 3, permit ticking other, with the youngster being able to provide their own answer if they wish. 3 questions, numbers 4, 5, and 6, have sub-questions which require an element of critical thinking. There are several questions which require interpsychological or social and intrapsychological or individual reflections. And the final question is a hypothetical question and a hypothetical situation. But also in 2015, the government gave schools permission to modify the questionnaire and to develop their own version. So there was also a questionnaire being circulated around schools in 2015 where there was a 34-question version. So everyone had freedom and flexibility, but clearly if there are 7 questions versus 34 questions, somebody's doing something in a lot more depth or covering many more areas. So that raises questions of consistency and amongst many other things. But the BRIT questionnaire is informed by the vulnerability assessment framework, which in turn is based on ERG 22+, which is based on prison inmates and extremist offenders. And what happened was, because of this, a lot of academics, a lot of leading experts around the world, educationalists, psychologists, including Noam Chomsky, wrote to the government at the time to say, we have concerns about the design validity of this questionnaire, and we would like to see this report produced by Monica Lloyd and Christopher Dean to see how you came up with this questionnaire. And the government's response was to classify that study that was produced by Monica Lloyd. Monica Lloyd, incidentally, was at the University of Birmingham. She's now an emeritus professor. This is the questionnaire. So I'm not sure how well you can see it here. I excuse the quality of this. Is it because it was leaked to the press? So it was administered clandestinely. You can imagine when you've got children aged 8 to 11, you have to have parental consent. There was no parental consent that was sought. A number of schools initially volunteered to take part in the study, but then when this was actually administered, bear in mind that teachers were not given any training. They weren't given any background information other than this is part of the BRIT project, which is a part of identity and belonging. And there was no training about how to interpret the results of the ticks and to then decide who to refer. Who should be referred to prevent officers for displaying susceptibility to radicalisation. The pupils had to provide their name, their year, their gender and their age. And this particular one initially was launched at Buxton School in London Borough of Waltham Forest. So it asked them questions like, how would you say that people can be trusted? Most people can be trusted, some people can be trusted, no one can be trusted. And then, which 3 words best describe who you are? And they had to tick. So the options were daughter or son, student, British, Muslim, Christian, Hindu, artist, athlete, young, and other. Now, this is quite strange choice of options here. An athlete, it's unlikely that an 8 to 11-year-old would consider themselves to be an athlete. There are why are certain religions included and others excluded? But there is the option here of other, and then the pupil could provide their own answer. It says, if you needed advice, who would you talk to? A family member, a teacher, a religious teacher, a friend, or other? So again, it's the suggestive nature of the questions here in terms of, the religious teacher and so on. How much do you trust people from these groups? And so you've got trust, not sure, don't trust. So it's things like my family, my neighborhood, people of my race or religion, people of another race or religion, a police officer, a school teacher. To what extent do you trust them? Then it was, have the following things happened to you in the past week, either inside or outside school? So someone has been mean to me. I mean, for goodness sake, this happens in playgrounds all the time. Someone's been mean to me. People have acted as if they are suspicious of me. I've experienced somebody's called me bad names. Someone physically hurt me. I've seen someone being physically hurt, etc. And then here we have a number of questions where, please tell us your opinion on the following statements. Do you agree, you're not sure, or you disagree? And so it's like people from different religions, races or religions, are probably just as good as people from mine. People should be free to say what they think, even if it offends others. Religious books are to be understood word for word. If a student was making fun of me or of my race or religion, I would try to make them stop, even if it meant hurting them. I believe my religion is the only correct one. It is my duty to defend my community from others that may threaten it. It is important to question what grown-ups tell you. It's never okay to use physical force to solve a problem. God has a purpose for me. I think most British people respect my race or religion. It is okay to marry someone from a different race or religion. I would do what a grown-up told me to, even if it seemed odd to me. I would mind if a person of a different race or religion moved next door to me. Women are just as good as men at work. And then there's a hypothetical situation at the end where it's saying, well, if there are people standing in a particular area and somebody's going to get hurt and something's going to fall on them, if you push somebody in front, is it okay to do that if it means essentially you harm one person or one person gets killed and other people are saved? Is it okay? It's absolutely right. It may be right. It may be wrong. It's absolutely wrong. So looking at it from that perspective. So there was a local government statement that was put out shortly after this was released to say that the Building Resilience Through Integration and Trust programme is not about prevent. It's clearly focused on helping children explore important issues around identity, values, their place in modern society. And then blah, blah, blah. Most importantly, it gives them critical thinking skills so that they can make their own informed, rational decisions. So this was the statement that the government put out, and the reason why they put out this statement was because the head teacher at Buxton School, one of the first schools where this questionnaire was launched, raised concerns about the nature of the questionnaire and its apparent link to prevent and counter-terrorism and extremism. When I went to the website for Waltham Forest today, this is what I got: access denied. So if it's open, if it's all fine, that raises questions about why. So unrestricted access to all areas of the hub is only available to registered users from subscribing schools and so on. So previously it was all open, now it's not. So I wanted to look at the questionnaire from three different perspectives. The first being this notion of cognitive development theories, given that the government statement was that the primary purpose of the questionnaire is to help pupils to consider their place in society, to develop critical thinking skills, and so on. So there are two leading child cognitive development psychologists that I would like to focus on here. The first is Jean Piaget, who is a Swiss psychologist, and he first developed the theory of age-based intellectual development of children. He examined the differences between the ways in which children think versus the way in which adults think. And he argued that thinking, reasoning, problem solving develop in that sequence, and at different levels of maturity. He stated that cognitive development is a prerequisite for language development. So children need to have reached a particular age of maturity and cognitive awareness before they can really use language effectively and understand it, effectively. He noted the progressive reorganization of mental processes and realities over time. So he said, as children grow, as they develop their cognitive abilities, they reclassify their understanding, I guess, just as we do as adults, but this is what he highlighted there. But he also highlighted that there are 4 stages of cognitive development. And the 2 stages that are important to us for the BRIT questionnaire are the concrete operational stage, which is stage 3, occurring between the ages of 7 to 11, which is when Piaget said it was the beginning of logical or operational thought for children. He said that the 4th stage occurs after the age of approximately 12. This is the formal operational stage, which is when children begin to process abstract concepts or think about problem solving and testing hypotheses. Now, you've seen from the BRIT questionnaire that we've just looked at that the questions contain critical thinking, hypothetical situations, and so on. But the questionnaire is administered to 8 to 11-year-olds, whereas according to Piaget, cognitive development for these particular skills doesn't occur until later. We've also got Lev Vygotsky. He was a Russian or Soviet psychologist, and he studied linguistics and philosophy prior to studying psychology. And he stressed the importance, rather than age, he stressed the importance of social interactions in the intellectual development of children. So he said that teachers and parents are key, as we'd probably expect, when it comes to constructivist learning and the development of cognition. And he argued the other way round to Piaget. He said that language development is a prerequisite to cognitive development. He outlined what he called crisis periods, when children navigate different grades of self-consciousness and self-determination. So he said these occur at birth, at the age of approximately 1 year, and then at ages 3, 7, and 13. He said that consciousness and cultural development occur in 2 stages. The first stage is the interpsychological or the social level, and the second is the intrapsychological or the individual level. So when we're thinking about our being, reflecting on our being, when we're thinking about our state of consciousness, our cultural development, and especially in relation to others, that this generally happens at a higher age. And he said that that's approximately at age 13 onwards when children really develop critical thinking skills. So again, the target of the questionnaire seems questionable. I then wanted to look at the language more closely. I wanted to look at the language of the questionnaire using the method of corpus linguistics. So this was with the Bank of English corpus. So this contains over 700 million words and over 29,000 texts. And it has 11 subcorpora, including language from UK, US, Australian, written and spoken English. And the method that I used was the corpus access tool, which is query language syntax. I wanted to look at the syntax and the order of the words, the grammatical occurrence of the words in the questionnaire to determine what kinds of texts, so of these different texts here, what kinds of texts do these particular phrases and the particular syntax typically occur in? And the results were as follows. When I looked at the phrase from question 2, best describe who you are, or how much do you trust from question 4, or people in my race or religion, or people of another race or religion, etc., etc., the whole list that you see here. In more than 29,000 texts, the Bank of English corpus returned a 0 frequency match per million words. So this particular syntax in each case is not common. So that raises the question of, if it's not that common, to what extent can children process this syntax if it's not frequently occurring in everyday language? I also then wanted to look specifically at some other phrases. So I looked at most people can be trusted, and I found 3 matches. There were 3 matches in 2 different text types, one being a magazine, the other being a lecture. I looked at the phrase, if you needed advice, and there was only 1 match in the corpus, and that was in a Guardian newspaper article. Race or religion, perhaps as would be expected, had the highest number of matches. There were 88 matches across 80 different text types. So when I looked at the text types, they were things like books about colonization, fat admirers, interfaith marriages, communist isolationism, unemployment, right-wing politics, prayers for victims of racism, xenophobia, and so on. The phrase suspicious of me occurred 17 times. There were 17 matches across 16 text types. These were unknown books, books related to the Gulf War, conspiracy theories, and the Bali bombings. God has a purpose for me. There was a match. There were 5 matches, and they were across 3 different text types. And there were 3 newspaper articles quoting the WWE wrestler Kurt Angle after he won his championship. And when he won the championship, as a Christian, as a believer, he said, God has a purpose for me. So that was a direct quote there. And then most British people. There were 36 matches in the corpus across 33 text types. This included 4 books, 28 newspaper articles, and 1 spoken text. Now, the point of this analysis is to demonstrate that none of these text types have anything to do with children. There's no children's books, there's no nursery rhymes, there's nothing here that you would link to children. So then that raises the question again about how suitable the language is. So then I decided to do a pilot study. I thought I'd take the questionnaire, speak to some, have a small group of children, give them the questionnaire, but then after giving them the questionnaire, I'd ask them to explain why they chose the answers they did. And one of the inspirations for this was I remembered when I was 10 years old, and at my primary school, I was given a questionnaire. I don't remember what the questionnaire was about, but I remember this particular question, which was, do you have a nanny? And I ticked the box saying yes. And when the questionnaire was collected, afterwards in the break, my teacher said to me, oh, Sophie, you're very posh, you have a nanny. And I said, everyone has a nanny. And it's because I was thinking of nanny, as in maternal grandmother. So even though I was, born, raised here, but my instant thinking was nanny, as in nanny. So that obviously I ticked it, and as far as they're concerned, I have a nanny, but I'm talking about my maternal grandmother. So I looked at 7 children. They all happened to be male. People were quite reluctant to give permission to let their children take part in this pilot study, including some family. None of my family members were willing to let their kids take part in this. They were really, really worried about how it would be used, or whether it would get out and so on, whatever. So they were aged 8 to 11. Ethnic background of the children was South Asian. Their socioeconomic background varied. Religion-wise, there were 4 Muslim children, 2 Hindu, 1 atheist. Just in terms of the background of the parents, 3 there were professionals, 2 PhD students, 2 fathers were white-collar workers, and mothers were housewives. The instructions I gave to them were just read the question, tick the box that most, reflects your opinion. And then after that, there was one-to-one discussion plus group-based discussion to elicit meanings from them. And I also gave them an opportunity to ask me questions at the end. It's worth saying that none of the things shown here in grey were instructions that were given actually in schools to pupils. And unlike the school ones, mine were anonymous. I didn't collect their names or any other details. So the key results were as follows. In terms of the syntax, so first of all, the time that it took the pupils to complete the questionnaire varied from 3 minutes to 7 minutes. And the results were that the syntax was either not understood or it was misunderstood or partially misunderstood. For example, they didn't quite understand fully what race or religion meant, or as if they are suspicious of me. Probably just as good as people from mine. Free to say what they like even if it offends others. It is my duty to defend my community. It is important to question what grown-ups tell you, and to do what a grown-up told me to do, even if it seemed odd to me. Now remember, in the Bank of English corpus, this returned 0 frequency. But for example, what we have here is we've got multiple clauses in some of these syntax, but also we've got certain words. So there's certain lexis that the pupils may be unfamiliar with, like community or suspicious or whatever. But 6G was an interesting one because this is the one where they all agreed. They all had the same interpretation of the question or of the statement. So it is important to question what grown-ups tell you. They thought it meant, if I don't understand something, I must ask a grown-up, not be critical about what grown-ups are telling you. So clearly, this then, I thought, okay, let me take a closer look at the lexis and ask them what the various words mean, key words. None of them could define race. 3 could not define trust. 1 said it meant to rely on someone. 3 couldn't define suspicious. Others said to be weary of something, not knowing someone, being spied on, or being curious in a bad way. 4 could not define offend. Others said it means being mean, not a happy thing, hurting feelings. 5 could not define defend. 1 said it meant the opposite of attack, and another one said it meant the right to protect your family. None of the pupils, none of them could defend community. 2 children attempted to define threaten. 1 said it was bribing somebody, and another one said if someone tries to steal stuff and you kill them. Maybe this is a bit of a worry, but if you do. 6 could not define physical force, and 1 said it meant to physically hurt someone. And 6 out of the 7 defined British people as those who come from Britain and believe in Christianity. 1 child said he was British, but in reality 4 of the children were British. So then this raises the question again about how reliable can the responses to the questionnaire be if the pupils are not understanding key lexis, I mean, one of these children, for example, went to a private school, a very posh private school, and he was the one who completed the questionnaire in 3 minutes. So I was expecting, but even he didn't understand all of the questions. So then this raises the question about to what extent is BRIT building resilience through integration and trust. When academics demanded transparency on the 2010 report, the government classified it. But 7 years later, Monica Lloyd and Christopher Dean published an academic paper in which they reported on the methodology of ERG 22+. And it's available through this link here. And in that paper, they acknowledged that their use of risk assessment protocols developed for criminal violence to assess those who may be politically motivated. So their risk assessment protocols were for criminal violence and those specifically linked to political motivation. They acknowledged that there was a deliberate intent to focus on the individual plus capturing family, friends, and the environment. They said that they had omitted things like political contexts or grievances and the impacts on possible extremist mindsets. They said there was a prevalence of mental health problems stemming from troubled or broken relationships or criminal mindsets and attitudes to justify offending among their prison study subjects. They said that a single framework to assess risk of extremist offending was not plausible. And they said that ERG requires, quote, requires a level of professional judgment and experience to be used effectively. They also said the current lack of demonstrated reliability and validity remain the main limitations of ERG at this time. It is not based on recorded and transcribed interviews, systematically analysed, or a transparent and replicable literature review. So this is the forensic psychologists themselves highlighting the limitations of ERG 22+, which is still in use by the government today. It still continues to underpin BRIT, the Vulnerability Assessment Framework, and other extremism risk assessment models. But it didn't just end there with pupils. Also in 2015, the year before the launch of the BRIT project, the Department for Education issued guidance to state-maintained schools that not only should they help pupils to understand fundamental British values and what right and wrong means and, and so on, but the school's ethos and teaching should also be made clear to parents, and that they should be made aware of the rule of English in civil and criminal law. And so in 2015, schools started offering anti-extremism, anti-radicalisation workshops to parents. Here's an example of a school in London, and on the 26th of June, they offered Preventing Radicalisation. Come and join us for this session. All parents are welcome. And this was for parents of 4 to 11-year-olds. What we also found at the same time was that there were incidences where certain political mindsets of whether it's the parents, whether it's the children, the older children perhaps, were being securitized. So police officers were going into schools and telling teachers that they should be mindful of the responses and the discussions and so on that pupils have in school, and the kind of responses that they give to determine what their political leaning or the family's political leaning is going to be, and the extent to which this may be aligned with extremist thought or fundamentalism or something along those lines. So pro-Palestinian activism in school was labelled extremism or anti-Semitic. Muslim Engagement and Development, or MEND, reported over 146 cases where 40% led to verbal or physical reprimand, where pupils were overtly expressing pro-Palestinian support. 17% of pupils had detentions, 2% were suspended, 12% were excluded, 2% resulted in the police being called, and 1% resulted in the counter-terrorism prevent referral. The most common punishment was for the display of outwardly Palestinian emblems like the flag, the keffiyeh, or vocal support for Palestine. And pupils were told that displaying the Palestinian flag, for instance, causes distress and may be interpreted as support for terrorism. Prevent referrals then, referrals to the counter-terrorism officers and so on. In 2015, when the BRIT project was launched, there were 4,000 referrals made to Prevent, with more than 400 of them being under 10 years old. The youngest was a child aged 4. And there wasn't just one child aged 4, there were multiple, but the youngest was 4. In 2017, 2,000 children were referred to Prevent. But the latest referral statistics, which were published by the government in December of 2023, show that there were a total of 6,817 referrals last year. 39% of the referrals came from educationalists, so schools, colleges, universities. 90% of the referrals are males, and 32% were aged between 15 to 20, which is the highest. At 31%, closely behind, were children under the age of 14. 9% of the 6,817 cases were referred to the Channel deradicalisation programme. Over 90% of the referrals were considered to be false. And since reporting began in 2015, minus the 2 lockdown years, so 2020 and 2021, when we were still in hybrid mode and so on, the highest referring authority, specified authority, each year has been the education sector. Most of the referrals for Prevent, they don't come from police, they don't come from surveillance officers, they don't come from the prison services, they come from the education sector. What also happened last year was that the government started to tinker with the definition of extremism. So in November 2023, soon after the 7th of October, and what transpired since, there were leaked documents that revealed hurried and controversial plans by the government to extend the definition of extremism. The document stated, extremism is the promotion or advancement of any ideology which aims to overturn or undermine the UK system of parliamentary democracy, its institutions and its values. So it's extending beyond fundamental British values to the UK system of parliamentary democracy. But what also this document also stated, and this was developed by Michael Gove and his team, it listed various organisations which it said could be captured with the new definition. It said among them are the Muslim Council of Britain, Palestine Action, and MEND, Muslim Engagement and Development. And this definition, which was leaked in November, came into law in March of this year. So this raises the question about the extent to which contest, prevent, BRIT and other counter-terrorism policies are counterproductive. The government continually shifts the narratives and the definitions to suit some political agendas. So, initially we're told BRIT is about identity and belonging and cohesion, but then it shifts to other things. Discussions on radicalisation, extremism and terrorism are tightly controlled in classrooms. So if you look at the various education policies and information that's revealed by the government, it states that teachers should be encouraged to have discussions, open discussions in the classroom so as to challenge any extremist thoughts which children might be displaying. But in reality, it's something else is happening. Muslim children are being identified as suspicious on the basis of vague criteria such as having an identity conflict which has no demonstrated link to terrorism. Tools to assess extremism, radicalisation, etc. lack transparency and have design flaws. And personnel in specified authorities have inconsistent and insufficient training to conduct accurate risk assessments for the prevent referrals as part of their legally mandated devolved responsibility stemming from the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act. But what's happening in the process of all of this is that the ethnic profiling of Muslims and Muslim children is marginalising, stigmatising, and securitizing this new suspect community after the Irish in the 1970s, and therefore it seems reasonable to assume that it may also be reinforcing Islamophobia. Thank you very much.